Hello and welcome to Open Door Philanthropy. This is your host, Dave Moss, and I'm here with Carmen James Randolph, CEO of the Women's Foundation of the South. Is that correct?
Correct. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning. Or evening for our listeners, if they're listening in the evening.
Yes.
So, speaking of our listeners, they know that I like to dive right into it with my guests, so let's do that. Where did you grow up? What was your childhood like?
I grew up in central Pennsylvania in
Hmm.
Harrisburg, PA. And my parents were both, my father migrated to Pennsylvania from South Carolina. My mother was born in Pennsylvania, but her family had migrated from um, Maryland and Virginia. And then of my cousins on my father's side, I was among that first generation of cousins born in the North. And I say that because I grew up in a family that had deep Southern roots. My father had what he called a garden. And when I tell people about my dad's garden, they're like, Carmen, that was a small farm. He had 2 acres that he gardened near our home, and another 5 acres, 5 or 6 acres that he gardened with my uncle and grew everything. So I can tell you that
Some
I
would call that
loved
farming.
gardening, but I did not. And
Then
I grew up with a tractor in my backyard and, planting and harvesting and all of that was a part of my childhood. Um, and that, as well as growing up in the AME church, where I had both members of my family, both sides of my family, a part of this historic Black AME church in Harrisburg. And my cousins were organists, pianists, drummers, on the choir, ushers, um, stewardesses, trustees, and that's aunts, uncles, cousins, my grandmother. So a big part of my childhood was anchored in the AME church and in family, with lots of cousins and spending a lot of time with my grandmother, who actually was the first to leave South Carolina and come north, and her children and my dad being the last later followed her. And I would just say that kind of anchored my childhood. It was filled with storytelling, lots of stories of growing up during the Jim Crow era in the South. Of On one side of my dad's family, they were sharecroppers, and on the other side of the family, they owned their land. And telling the difference in the stories of his mother's family and his father's family, and telling tales like Brer Rabbit tales and things like that. So I would say later, as I went on to school and study American Studies, I took a folk life course. And when I was learning about stories in African American culture, I'm like, oh my God, these are things I grew up with. These are the stories of my youth.
that
So
makes you pause for a moment in Harrisburg. I've been to Harrisburg many times. When I went to Dickinson, I took the train to Harrisburg and had to arrange some kind of ride from the Harrisburg train station to campus. Um, that's most of my experience with Harrisburg. But you grew up raised by your parents and some aunts and uncles, and they were all Southern, and they
I
all
would say yes. On my father's side, all Southern born moved to Pennsylvania.
moved to
On my
Harrisburg,
mother's,
Pennsylvania.
Mhm. And
Good choice.
what drew people to that part of Pennsylvania was Bethlehem steel. So
Yeah.
this is part of the Great Migration story, and so a lot of my uncles and cousins worked in the steel mill.
Uh, yes, I've seen it's big. There are large steel mills. I have heard when I went to Dickinson that the I've heard the area sometimes called the Alabama of Pennsylvania. The Dickinson's much more out in the where there are gardeners,
Yes.
beautiful farming communities in the surrounding area. And I lived a little bit in North Carolina with my folks where they live now, so I know a little bit about what the South is. And I'm from the North, very far, the northernmost state on the East Coast. And when I was in Cumberland County and around Harrisburg, it did seem a little bit more like the South than the North. Would you agree with that?
I will. I'd agree with that. I would say central Pennsylvania is a very conservative area as well. But for
Very
me
much
as a
South.
child, it was a beautiful place to grow up. And like I said, those years of my life were closely nestled with family.
Mhm.
Lots of cousins, aunts and uncles on both sides, and extended family. Um,
Are any of them still in? Are they all still in Harrisburg?
some who are still in Harrisburg. My mother still lives there. My brother is also in Harrisburg, and I still have cousins who live in Harrisburg. So when in those moments when I go home and we have family gatherings, it's always fun to get together and spend time with my cousins and things. So absolutely.
Do you remember the first time that you made a gift or did something generous?
Well, I tell you this, growing up in the AME church and in a very close knit community, what we exercised as philanthropy, we wouldn't have called it philanthropy. Instead, it was, making fried chicken dinners and selling dinners to help kids go to camp, or helping a family that got burned out of their home, or making a contribution that way, or fundraising, doing a choir. I was in several choirs, and we would do concerts as fundraisers and things like that. So I would say I was very active in fundraising, in supporting community through involvement in my church, involvement in the what was called the YPD, or Young People's Department. And also, I got involved in the NAACP as a young person. So I was very active, and a lot of that activity involved raising money for whether it was a team, a choir, a family, helping people go to college, and what have you. And I can tell you, I remember the first grant I received, and I received a grant that was called a book scholarship from Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority my senior year in college. And it was that book grant that helped pay for my books my first year in college. So um, I just remember more clearly being involved in fundraising activities. And then I distinctly remember the first grant I received, the first time I received
So you applied for,
philanthropy.
like, I think a lot of Americans, their first exposure with needing to apply for something was college related. But you'd had a depth of fundraising experience, unlike most 17-year-olds,
Yeah.
which probably made you pretty competitive for that book scholarship.
Well, I was such an active kid that my parents often said they were relieved when I went to school, when I went to college.
My
I was
parents
a kid that
said the same
I
thing. Yeah.
And I loved riding my bike as a kid. That was a big part of my childhood, was riding my bike everywhere. And I was a kid that my parents said, you have too many places to go, too many commitments. You are not just riding a bike. You must get your driver's license." So I was forced to get my driver's license. But like I said, I was in multiple choirs. I was on a debate team. I ran track. I was in gymnastics. I danced for 17 years, and was a part of student council. So it was just a ton of activity that I was doing. And fundraising was a part of many of those activities.
Yes, it was gonna say it's a diverse array of activities. There's some of the arts in there, and giving back to the community. And I assume you were doing some studying and
Yes, I was.
reading books, hopefully, right? More than
Oh
one.
my gosh, I was a
If you have a
voracious
bookshelf.
reader as a child. Just
Um,
I would inhale books.
you're supposed to, and inhaling them. That's very bad for you. You're supposed to use your eyes. I think that's
That's
what
so
they
funny.
call in the books a metaphor.
Yes.
um, so, a very, like I said, a lot of different activities. But as you pointed out, you can kind of connect your involvement in all of those activities through the fundraising. You are kind of a natural born fundraiser, right? Was it? Do you think it was nature, or you've described mostly the nurture of it, right? Your participation in the church, right, and some other things, and then also the need to fundraise when going off to college probably helped with it, right? But is there? Are you a natural fundraiser?
I would say more than a natural fundraiser. I was groomed to be a natural leader and groomed to do things like in our church, for instance, youth were given the opportunity to lead the Sunday service at least once a month. So, and that is leading the entire program. So, being like the mistress of ceremonies or speaking at key parts in the ceremony. Those were things that I was groomed doing. So, in terms of being in the position to raise money for things, absolutely. Being able, I was encouraged to be confident. So, the confidence in what it is that you're doing and what you believe in, and being able to make that point clear to other people, to be persuasive and compelling. Those were skills absolutely that I developed as a young person.
So you think it's mostly been nurture for you. You were supported and nurtured, and now you are able to do it.
Yes.
Do you think there are any innate skills or natural talents or abilities that make someone a better, not just fundraiser, but I would say social good practitioner, humanitarian, community organizer?
Yeah. I mean, I talked about growing up with a lot of storytelling.
Hmm.
And my dad was just he was such a powerful griot. He was a storyteller. So I grew up hearing stories all the time, learning how to tell stories, and loving storytelling. And I do think being an excellent storyteller is one of the skills that is important in being a successful fundraiser.
Indeed, and also a successful podcast guest. Guest. All right. So, what kind of uh, causes do you support personally? Like when I assume they give you a paycheck there at the Women's Foundation. In fact, I know they do because I've seen their 990.
Well, I would say, first of all, we offer employees the opportunity to be a waymaker, and that is a monthly donor to the Women's Foundation. It's total, you have the option. People can opt in or opt out. So I
Folks
would
who
say,
work there,
first,
folks who work there donate to can donate. You have a program for folks
yes.
who work
So we've
at the
had,
organization to donate to the organization.
yes, so we
Do
have
you
100%.
and you participate in that? Yes,
Yes, we
you
have
must.
100% staff giving, and we also have 100% board giving to WFS. And I'm a waymaker, first and foremost to
Way
WFS.
Waymaker?
Way, WAY,
You're making
make,
the way.
yes, making the way. This is a startup public foundation. So we love our waymakers, and we have people who give as anywhere from $10 a month to 50 or $100 a month. So,
Why don't you give? So we'll. I look forward to talking at length about your work life, and it's
sure.
and it's interesting to know that you donate to where you work.
Yes, so that's the first. I
Yeah, I'm curious to
also
know about other.
prioritize.
Like, do you donate to other causes?
Yes. So my husband and I are um, very diligent about donating to nonprofits that work with marginalized communities. We donate to nonprofits that work with people who've been incarcerated, both men and women. We work with youth. We donate to youth organizations that serve youth, especially um, considered at risk or youth at promise in that age group of 18 to 24. It's an age group that's been near and dear to my heart for a very long time. And we also donate to organizations that basically support people of color in areas that are deeply needed, whether it's health, resources. And then finally, I also support the arts. So,
Mhm.
support nonprofits that
Any
work in the
particular art?
arts and help young people. Pardon me?
Any particular art?
Oh gosh, I have here in Louisiana, I have supported cultural centers. I've also supported theater companies.
Hmm. You mentioned that you danced for a moment.
I did. I did.
As I understand, there's a decent amount of art in New Orleans.
A decent amount for
I
sure.
we
Part
haven't
of
actually yet. I have been for the podcast to New Orleans. We is a young man I know named Ben Swig who lives there, who's from a prominent Jewish funding family. In fact, he's Ben Swig the fifth or something. And the name Swig is on a lot of buildings, and that's most of what we talked to him about. But that's my only time actually ever been to New Orleans. I saw a lot of very cool art while I was there. Perhaps some of it funded by you. Thank you very much. So you mentioned that you went to American University.
yes,
You said, and you majored in American Studies.
I sure did.
Very American education you had.
Absolutely.
Can you
I
talk
at the
talk a little
time
bit about?
wanted to be Oh, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
oh,
Go
go you
ahead.
go ahead. You wanted to tell a story.
Well, I at the time wanted to be a lawyer.
Okay.
And when I had talked to folks about, well, what was the best thing for me to study in preparation for being a lawyer, I thought maybe I needed to be a poli sci major. And overwhelmingly, I was told that the thing that would benefit me the most was a solid degree in liberal arts and a solid liberal arts education so I could write, I could be prepared for lots of reading, so on and so forth. So that was my plan. I'd go to American University, get a good solid liberal arts education, be an American studies major, and prepare for law school. What I didn't expect was how I fell in love with humanities.
Hmm. Very good. So I think a lot of, I mean, I think I vaguely remember wanting to be a lawyer when I went off. I'm not sure if that was even true. I think it's just what I was saying because everybody asks you, right, what do you want to be, and that's a very acceptable answer that doesn't get a lot of follow up questions. Um, the so Fans of the show will know that my father was a professor of American Studies. In fact, he's been a guest on the show a couple times. Um, and when I was asking him a little bit about what it was like to teach American Studies, one, he said that it changed a lot while he was teaching. We don't need to give any specific dates, but he was teaching American Studies at the same time at Colby College while you were majoring in it and I asked him about how it was different then from perhaps now, and he said at the time it would be extremely interdisciplinary.
Yes.
There would not be any American Studies professors, which now there are. There are people who they are American Studies professors. My dad was a U.S. history professor, and the
Mm.
American Studies department was made up of U.S. government professors, U.S. history professors, English professors who specialize in American English, sociologists who specialized in American behaviors and that sort of thing. So you would say, and I think, and I know from my time in DC that American University does have a good, strong reputation for being, like you said, you get a good base liberal arts education. Similar, I imagine, to what I got at Dickinson, which was a very similar reason I wanted to go there. Learn how to write, learn about a lot of different things, get a good general liberal arts education, which I think has prepared me very well. Did you enjoy the interdisciplinary nature of your education? Do you think that has prepared you for a career in philanthropy?
Absolutely. At the time, the American Studies Department at AU was highly interdisciplinary. In addition to the areas that you mentioned, anthropology was a big part
Right.
as well.
Yeah.
So, taking courses that were either grounded in anthropology and literature and history um, gave me just a significant grounding in culture and not just, and I'll just be frank, white American culture, but
Mhm.
other cultures as well. And looking at pressing social issues like poverty and how um, poverty develops, has been exacerbated, so on and so forth. It really prepared me for deeper inquiry and analysis of situations and circumstances, as well as having a broad appreciation and love for people and just in the richness of our diversity, as well as how in many ways we are very similar. So that
Mhm.
was my experience in American studies. And then one thing that happened for me after, and I was very active on campus. So my desire to go into law was grounded in wanting to fight for justice and be a voice in the fight for justice. And on campus, I was involved with the Black Student Alliance. I was the president of the BSA for a few years, very involved in the gospel choir, and very involved in writing for our student newspaper, our Black student newspaper, which was called the Uhuru. Um, so I would say all of those things melded together to help create a deep sense of purpose for me on campus. And I was a part of a scholarship program called the Frederick Douglass Scholars. And I was one of the first Frederick Douglass Scholars that came from outside of DC. So I was in the scholarship program with other African American students. And ours was the first year that students came from other places than Washington, D.C.
So a question that I almost always ask is if my guests had any understanding of how their college was funded while they went there. We've been fortunate to have a large number of Harvard graduates on the show, and I particularly like asking them if they like when you went, did you know that they had $16 billion, right, or whatever it is? Or do you know how much money they have now? It's like up to 70 billion or something. I don't know exactly how American is funded. I think they have some endowment or whatever, and probably grants. And I know it's a big difference between American and Dickinson would be that it's probably a lot more practical because of its location in DC, a lot more like real life opportunities. I know now that the internship program is I've myself have had many interns from American, which would be harder to do from a place like Dickinson. Um, I suspect that when you attended school, you had a pretty decent understanding about how some of the stuff was funded, not just
I did not.
so you didn't know how this you it didn't even occur. Yeah, I think that's intentional. I think colleges don't necessarily want the students to understand what's going like how the sausage is made while they're there.
Yeah,
And
exactly. I had
immediately
no real.
afterwards, it's like we need money. Oh, hey, alumni, we need money desperately, which works very well. They are some of the best. They're some of the best fundraisers.
Absolutely.
In addition to the financing of the campus, which you've candidly admitted you did not understand at the time, appreciated. you were applying for some scholarship programs like the Frederick Douglass and other things. Did you understand how? So I don't imagine that this was funded by Frederick Douglass.
No, absolutely not.
I
It
mean, it
was
might have.
named for him.
I didn't want to speak. I
And
didn't
honestly,
want
when
to
I was
assume.
a student, I did not know any of that. Though that was not a place of my awareness or even understanding.
Hmm.
Mm-mm.
And I mean, do you think you would have been? I mean, you got into the school and you won the book scholarship, and you were a pioneer for the Frederick Douglass scholarship, so it was working out for you. Um, uh, what do you think about the fact that it was like that these were just sort of apples put in your road for you to run after, right? That you weren't necessarily understanding who was placing them or why. Is that
I would just say, as an African American student who worked hard, who studied hard, to be able to secure an academic scholarship that made it easier for my parents to be able to afford me going to college. Um, because I announced to my parents I was going, and ironically, I'd only applied to one school, and that was American. I was told that's where I should go, so that's where I applied.
you only applied?
And yeah, and then I was contacted. My guidance counselor was like, "Listen, you need to apply to other schools, and I have a recruiter that wants to talk to you from Rochester." So I didn't want to apply, but I ended up applying, and I was offered an opportunity to go to U of R, and I turned that down for American. But my poor parents, I basically told them what I was doing, and they had no clue how they could make it happen for me. Um, and it made it possible for me to go to school.
How did you find out about these opportunities? Do you recall?
Um, well, yes, there's a very clear way that I found out about the book scholarship. So I was a debutante,
Which
and I was a debutante in
I
the
had I
debutante
had
hall
assumed.
for Alpha 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 during my senior year. And part of being a debutante actually is fundraising for Alpha Kappa,
Mhm.
for was fundraising for the sorority. And so, as a debutante, they look at everything. They look at your grades. They look at your civic involvement, so on and so forth. And from there, they determine who it is they make awards to. So I didn't even apply for the book scholarship that was awarded to me on merit. And then also in terms of American University, I had applied, I had gotten into the school, did not have a beat at all on financial aid, how we were going to make it work. And it was upon my visit to campus that I met representatives from the Frederick Douglass program who talked to us, who then encouraged me to apply. And then I was awarded that scholarship.
And I'm glad that you were. It seems to have been worked out. I think that was a good investment.
Mm-hmm.
The It's very interesting to me. We This is the open door. I hope my questions don't sound too probing, but this is the open door philanthropy podcast. We like to understand how these philanthropic decisions are made. And I happen to think that one of the reasons that so many Americans do not understand how these decisions are made is that their first experience with it is often through some sort of college application or scholarship application process, which is generally done behind closed doors with little understanding from the applicant.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And then when they graduate from school and have to apply for real grants from foundations, they're not necessarily in the best of positions because they don't really understand how these decisions are made. And grants are different from scholarships, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Because scholarships are individually based, and grants are based on
Can this
the performance
organization do
or
this?
what have you of an organization. And I would say this, like I told you, my thinking when I was in school was I was preparing to become a lawyer.
Mhm.
I didn't know diddly squat about the nonprofit sector, and I also didn't know anything about philanthropy. So I was involved in thinking that I was going to be a part of a fight for justice and not understanding um, how this all plays out in community. And I wasn't even necessarily thinking I was going to stay in DC. So, what
Mhm.
um,
I'm familiar with that.
led me to this on this course was I decided to wait a year before going to law school, and in that time, I applied for a job at the Humanities Council of DC at the recommendation of my former advisor from college. She said, "This is a job. I think you should apply for it. You would be great working for the Humanities Council." And
They do there at the Humanities Council.
well, on a broad level, they re-grant funds from NEH to communities, so it's a re-granting entity, but it also does programmatic work. So eventually, I was hired as the director of programs there, and I did some re-granting work, but I also worked very deeply in community. I worked in public housing communities, doing public humanities programs. That's a big way of saying I did programs that were grounded in both literacy and helping to build literacy, and also for seniors, I did oral history projects.
Cool. It sounds like it's a desire for the desire for justice that originally made you want to be a lawyer is also what gets you into this first job where they happen to do grant making, but that's not why you weren't like I want to get into grant making. I'm going to go there. As an aside, at Unfunded List, we have reviewed a couple submissions to the Humanities Council. I believe they were arts projects, some other local DC based stuff. But you're there for a while and you get promoted a couple times. I assume at some point you develop an interest in philanthropy and start to think of yourself as a grant maker.
Well, in order to, like, for instance, the program that I was charged with developing, it was called the City Lights Program. Wow, that's really reaching back into my memory. It's called the City Lights Program. And I remember when I first started and I started talking about what we needed and what my ideas were, the woman who I worked for said, "Listen, you have a $30,000 budget, and that includes your salary.
Mhm.
So if you want more, you're going to have to raise the money." And so therefore, I set out to learn how to fundraise and how to raise money from foundations, how to raise money from donors, and eventually grew that program to a $500,000 program with a core of 12 writers that were working with me from the Writers Corps. So I also ended up managing an AmeriCorps program.
Hmm.
And having the experience of growing that program and fundraising, it helped me build relationships with local foundations and people working in the philanthropic sector.
And from there, you went on to work at the Eugene and Agnes Meyer Foundation. I think they just call it the Meyer Foundation now.
Mhm.
Condolences to Eugene and Agnes for getting dropped. So I lived in DC for 15 years, and you worked. I think you worked at the foundation for 15 years. We overlapped a decent amount. I know that it's one of the big shot foundations in the DC area. I'd love to hear about your time working there. That's a long time to be at like a leading foundation.
Yeah. Well, I
What's
would
changed
say
in the 15 years?
when I first talked with former President Julie Rogers about working at the foundation, she let me know that she had been following my career for some time and was very interested in bringing me on board to work at the foundation. She also let me know that I was the youngest person that she had ever talked to about bringing into the foundation in a programmatic way.
Not
Um,
the youngest person she'd ever talked to.
about bringing, yes, and
She had
about
met
bringing,
some. She had like spoken to children before,
Of
right? Like
course.
holiday
Of
parties and things. I wouldn't be
Yes.
surprised. I've met Julie myself, and it's possible that she's only ever spoken to adults.
No, it's not. Well, I meant in terms of
She was very
as
professional.
hiring as a program officer. So she brought me on board
You were
as
Meyer's
a,
youngest program officer. Yeah.
yeah,
And
at the
they were
time.
counted a long time ago in like 1940s or something.
Well, and I tell you, when I came on board, I was 29. I had my 30th birthday there. And
Just last year.
all of my colleagues were in their 40s and 50s, some even 60, because at that time, philanthropy was the job that you
Oh, very
retired from.
old. Yeah,
These were,
you said it much more different. You called it the job you retired from, right? And
yeah,
I just said old. But yeah, I mean, my experience with philanthropy in DC is with the decision makers and even the program. Everybody was, especially when I was in my 20s. It was actually kind of difficult because they were several generations removed from me.
yeah. And so you're talking about a field where these jobs were highly coveted positions
Mm.
and people got in them and were made to be very comfortable and didn't leave. So that's what the field looked like when I entered, and not too many people who looked like me worked in philanthropy in DC. So not only were we talking about much older, but we're also talking about very white. So
Mhm.
not a lot of people of color in the field. There were some, but far and few between. And that is something that I saw change, and I was a part of that change while I was in philanthropy in DC. And I would say that Meyer was very intentional, not just hiring older people, but also hiring people who had deep experience in the nonprofit sector, more than fundraising experience, but deep experience in the nonprofit sector. Most of my colleagues, and by the time I had gone there, I had been interim director of the Humanities Council. I'd been an assistant director, so I'd managed a nonprofit. I'd worked with a board, and all of my colleagues shared that experience. All of my colleagues had run either arts organizations or nonprofit management organizations or health organizations. Um, so there was a real understanding of what it takes to do the work, and also um, a deep and spoken charge to build partnership with nonprofits in the community. And I will say that being a foundation that had so many organizations applying to us, it was just, the volume was incredible.
Mhm.
And I focused on youth and education. And if you can imagine how many youth serving organizations there are in the
Yeah,
DC
a lot of them
metropolitan region
worked for
or
several.
education groups, I would have easily in a grant round 80 to 90 proposals or 90 letters of inquiries to review. It was just a big volume of folks. So
Quite a lot.
getting to a yes it took time. And
We
there are
we had a
folks
number
who,
of program officers on the show, and I almost always ask them for a specific number, like how many do you individually have to get through? And I'd say that the average I've heard is like 30 to 50, 50 at like the higher end. So you were, and it makes sense to me. I worked at the Seed Foundation for a while in DC and some other youth serving organizations, and it was anything I applied to. We knew uh, education and also health are the two just most competitive things you could possibly apply for. Your proposals better be doesn't. I mean, you got to go do good work. That's a given, right? But also your proposals need to be ship shape. And that's something I like to like get into the meat of on the show here, because that's something where the door, like that, reading those 9 proposals and making those decisions, that's where the door has often been closed. With a couple of old white guys in there, or maybe just one old white guy, right, making some like some random decisions, possibly, or just sort of decisions based on who he knows and whatever. The thing that's most interesting to me
and
in philanthropy right now is what you were talking about, and it seems to be a very encouraging trend. And it also seemed kind of like common sense. Foundations hiring people who actually know what they're doing as program officers, right? And bringing them from the field that is being funded so that they can actually understand what's happening. I think the best grant proposals that I've ever read here and that I've ever been involved with have actually been written in collaboration between grant writer and program officer, right? Have been more communications tools, transparency tools between funder and fundee than request letters. As a like open request, right? Read all these proposals from all these different organizations and pick which the best one is, right? Just based off of only this document. Well, you get one document per organization, right? That seems difficult. But I do think that that document can be a very useful tool in an ongoing process for hopefully you have a relationship with grantees. So can you talk a little bit about, did you have relationships with grantees or
Oh,
grantees while you were reading those proposals?
absolutely. And I developed deep relationships with folks. I've encouraged folks and I say this now to nonprofits, that don't take a no as no, not ever,
Mm-hmm.
and always seek to understand why and ask for that feedback. And it was something that was very important to me to give folks feedback as to why we were not able to fund them, or what would make their request stronger or more strategic, or if it was something that was absolutely new on the scene and I wanted to learn more. I'd encourage people to have those conversations. So there were times that folks had to probably applied for the better part of 2 or 3 years before I could get them on my docket. So in that time, it wasn't that there were no conversations, there were conversations. I encouraged people to include me on their mailing list, to
Mm-hmm.
learn more about what they were doing, how they were supported, what their events were, so on and so forth. I couldn't promise to go to all the many events that
Yeah.
were happening in DC, but certainly I would try to be in community and attend things that I was able to attend. So, absolutely, I developed deep relationships. And the other thing about Meyer that I think is was unique unto itself at that time was that Meyer believed very strongly that general operating support was capacity building,
Mm-hmm.
and that you could build nonprofits, you could help them build their capacity by giving consistent general operating support. And then also, Meyer had one of the first um, management assistance or nonprofit effectiveness programs there. So we
Yes, I remember.
ran our management assistance program
Right. Yeah.
alongside our grant making program. So the kinds of questions that I was asking grantees and the kinds of support and how that lined up with the management assistance that we were giving them, that was strictly about how we help them build their capacity, and specifically at strategic moments in an organization's growth, whether it was this was the moment they were staffing up, or this is the moment where they were planning for leadership succession, or this is the moment where they were getting their first building, and it was about how we prepare them for a capital campaign. Um, and this kind of grant making went hand in hand. So our grant meetings and questions of grantees was about their board, was about the engagement of their board, was about their capacity to do fundraising, was about their ability to provide benefits, health insurance, retirement for their employees. Um, what their internal practices were like. Did they have internal financial procedures and policies that govern the organization? So those were not questions that I think that a lot of nonprofits were used to, foundations asking them, but we weren't asking those questions and um, responding in a way that was punitive, like, you don't have this. No. Instead, it was, what are the resources we need to help shore up this organization and help it grow? So, one of the organizations, just to give you an example, that I was very proud to be the first donor, the first program officer that supported them, was the Patricia Sitar Center. And when the Sitar Center first came to us, it was a
In Adams,
small little,
Morgan.
yep, it was a small little program in
I've
the
heard of that.
basement of an apartment in
Yeah.
Adams Morgan. And helping them secure Meyer funding. And what we were very clear that Meyer served as like a good housekeeping seal of approval. If Meyer funded an organization, often other dollars would follow.
Hmm.
So here this was a tiny, teeny tiny little after school music instruction program in the basement of a building in Adams Morgan. And giving them very strategic, consistent support, growing our support. I don't even remember what that first grant was like. Maybe it was $10 or $15,000 to a point where we were giving them maybe upwards of 60 or 75,000 a year, and supporting their executive leadership, supporting their board development, supporting their capital campaign, and that led to them having a beautiful center that serves hundreds of children in Adams Morgan. So, just to give you an idea of,
Yeah, that's an excellent. So, one thing that was in my mind as you were telling that, one, that's, I would say, best practice funding, especially for like new organizations. And I think it's a good example. Folks in the DC area will know the Sitar Center, and if they were there,
yes.
that it went from being small to just, I know I noticed. I lived in the neighborhood. I lived on Ontario. We at Unfunded List review a lot of proposals for Mary's Center, which is,
Absolutely.
in fact, I have a board member who is one of their grant writers. And I should also mention we've reviewed many proposals submitted to Meyer, right, folks. So like and they would mention that they would get the feedback from the funder itself, but then they would also come to us because we give independent, right, outside feedback on the proposals, which they often quite helped. A lot of the stuff that you were doing in there, general operating dollars, right, and right, working with organizations and right, thinking about management assistance, is, it seems to me, the kind of ideas that you'll get when you hire nonprofit folks as program officers. You're nodding.
Yes.
It is a podcast, so the folks at home won't know, but it seemed
Yes.
like a vigorous nod. Um, my experiences with foundations that do not have anyone with that experience, right, have sometimes been, and this is something else you mentioned, right? So, like for instance, the sustainability question can sometimes be phrased in a way that seems accusatory. Why aren't you more
Exactly.
sustainable? Right? When in fact what they just wanted to know what's going on with your sustainability. But when you've been in the position of reading that proposal, you might understand and ask the question in a better way. A lot of the authors that come to us are terrified of that question and don't know like what funders are asking for on it and everything. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that, right, they not haven't necessarily been in their shoes. So would you agree with that? Do you think these tactics came from Meyer, like deliberately hiring people with experience?
Oh, most definitely, as well as supporting research to understand trends in the field.
Mm,
Um, there was the Compass Point study that we supported that looked at executive leadership in
mhm,
nonprofit sector and what challenges executive leaders faced,
mhm.
especially leaders of color, and how their experiences were different. Um, so I would say through not only the experience of the people that were hired, but also the practices, the interest in research and deepening our knowledge of what was happening in the field. And then the last thing that I would say that was different about my experience with at the Meyer Foundation, it was a part of my job description to be a leader. It was a part of my job description to be a leader locally and nationally in my intended areas. So I was not only encouraged to be a part of leadership locally. So I was very involved in Washington Grant Makers. chaired working groups of
The
Washington grant
Washington
makers.
Regional Association for Grant Makers.
Yes.
I used to make
Of
videos for them, and I'm the one that said the name in at the beginning of
yes.
the videos, which they just changed. And actually, I didn't write this in the questions because they announced it this morning. They've
Oh,
changed
what's the?
their. I that you've. This is an excellent segue because this is the next question I was going to ask you, and I apologize, it's not in the script.
I
They
know.
have changed their name. They rebranded today.
Oh, okay. And what's the new name?
So the Washington Regional Association of Grant Makers is now Philanthropy DMV.
Philanthropy DMV.
And I did briefly
Okay.
read the description as to why, and they said that it is more inclusive of their partners in
Mhm.
Maryland and Virginia. I guess just saying
Okay.
regional wasn't enough and too much. And also, it is RAG is an unfortunate acronym, which
Yes.
they did not mention in the press release. But there's another important philanthropy organization in DC, the Catalog for Philanthropy.
Yes.
They rebranded earlier this year as well, and they are now called Spur Local.
Very local. That's cool.
Spur Local, yes. And the focus is about, I think it's a focus on local giving and
Yeah.
spurring it.
Yeah. Or spurring giving.
So and so this is so I guess it's news to you that these rebrands.
Yes,
But
it
what do you
is. This it's
these are
making news that
organizations
this
that
is
you were
new.
involved with that had, I think, kind of older names that they were given their names a long time ago by a previous
Yes.
generation of philanthropists, by older
Yes.
white folks. It was older white folks that chose those names, and I'm certain there were young people of color involved in these rebrands.
Well, I can tell you that there were people involved in the working groups of Washington Grant Makers, which is now, you said, Philanthropy DMV,
Yeah,
when
philanthropy.
I was present. And it was a space where we got to be activists, honestly. And I can tell you, I was quite proud to be a part of a movement to help create what unfortunately no longer exists, but it was called the Children Youth Investment Trust Corporation, the Trust.
Yeah,
And we
I remember that.
secured millions of dollars from National Philanthropy at a time when National Philanthropy was not investing in DC, just point blank would not invest. And so I was a part of going to New York, meeting with different funders, talking with um, different funders and getting them to invest in the trust, to invest in DC, and to help build a system of out of school care and support for young people in DC. So being a leader locally to champion work, to champion our city, to bring resources to our city from national funders was a part of the work, but also in terms of the charge to be a leader nationally. And this just wasn't the case with me. My colleagues also were on the boards of different affinity groups, or whether it was Grant Makers for Health or Grant Makers for the Arts. We were involved in, or NFG, we were involved on those boards in those affinity groups fairly deeply. And I think that in all, that helped to establish the identity of the Meyer Foundation is much bigger, probably, than what we were, because we had presence not only on the local level, but also
Actually, it was I did
nationally.
when I looked at the endowment, it was much smaller than I thought. I think their name rings out a lot of money. It's hundreds of millions of dollars, so no one played the violin for them or anything. But I assumed billions based on the reputation and the role, and I think it was they were just leaning into their leadership role.
Yes.
I wholeheartedly agree that, and I so one of our very first guests on the show was Barbara Harmon
Yes.
at the catalog, and we have I think at least half of their current staff of Spur Local reviews proposals for me. And previously, I did do some. I made David, who's editing this podcast, and I did some videos with. God, I'm straining my memory here. Tamara, is that her name? Who
Oh,
was running?
Tamara Copeland?
Yes, that was her name. So we worked with her on a video project with the Putting Racism on the Table campaign to get funders to talk more openly about racism. An interesting part of that was that there were some of the funders pushed back very hard, just about talking about race. In the survey data, there were many of them wrote like at length that like it shouldn't even be discussed during grant makers. They were the minority opinion, but it was very interesting to hear, and I think that is an antiquated idea. But my specific question is here. So I wholeheartedly agree. These two organizations have done great work. Why would they both feel the need to rebrand now in 2023? Do you suppose?
Um, I have been so deeply, it's been, and I must
Yeah, I
say
realize
this,
you're
it's,
outside of it now.
yeah, I've been outside of DC now for
In some ways,
nine
that's why I'm
years.
interested in your opinion on this question. Does it?
Yeah, for 9 years. And I would say that, whereas when I was in DC, where it was harder to get people to talk about race, I remember Terry Freeman, when she was leading the Community Foundation, she was the first to start this Putting Race on the Table initiative. And it was one thing to look at disparities in education, it was another thing to look at disparities in healthcare. But to name those disparities and talk about the people who were most vulnerable or impacted by those disparities in terms of African Americans, in terms of Latinos and other immigrants, it was very difficult to get people to even say those things, let alone to develop specific strategies that address the communities that were most impacted by disparities. So that's where things were in the 15 years, and now that's 25 or so years ago when
Mhm.
I was working in DC,
Over 5 years.
um, and working in those issues. And then, I think we're at a point, especially given the racial reckoning that this country has experienced, since the brutal murder of George Floyd and so many other African Americans, where we've had to reckon with this issue of race in new and profound ways to say, wait a minute, this is not a race neutral country. And if you thought so, if you believe so, you were fooling yourself. I think from 2016 on, this, we have been confronted with such deep polarization in this country, um, and polarization of ideas and acrimony around difference and around being inclusive and telling more inclusive stories and putting other people's histories and making them valid. And we are in such a pendulum swing, back to, um, really harmful policies and actions. I mean, that I think these are, and especially being in the South, we are feeling these changes so profoundly in terms of deeply trying to, outlaw sharing people's history, banning books, um, having trigger laws around affirmative action. We have some states that if you are an organization who's doing DEI work, you cannot receive state dollars. And if you receive funding from an organization that is a DEI funder, then you can also lose state funding.
I suspect
So,
we'll see even more of that in the future, unfortunately, depending on how
yeah. So
most.
I think our
Just to close,
times,
I'd like to close out DC. Whenever I have a
yeah,
guest who spends some time in DC, we have to spend some time talking about it.
no, that's
And I
fine.
think
But I
we'll
would like
wrap
to
up with.
say,
Oh,
but
please
I
go ahead.
would like to say, I think the moment has called for those who are interested in racial and gender justice and those who are committed to, truly, um, fighting disparities in education, in, economic security, in health and well being, to take a fresh look at how we define our work and how we name that work moving forward.
And then just to close in the rebrand thing, I think that's generally what's happened. I think and I think DC foundations came together through RAG and some other things and were ahead of the curve when it comes to putting race on the table with their grant making processes, which is now something that foundations, social justice minded foundations across the country have been working on for a while now, and sometimes struggling with, not always doing well with, which I hope to talk about more in a bit. But I do think, particularly in DC, those two names, Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers and Catalog for Philanthropy, where a particular catalog was like the British spelling and everything. And it was just sort of associated with an older mindset of philanthropy. And these organizations now have new folks working there and that who are leaders and who wanted names that better suited their names. Right. And I think a lot of that comes down to inclusivity. I think even the worst of grant makers can get better at grant making with a little inclusivity. Right? A foundation founded by Jewish folks, right? That's funding in areas with very poor Black folks can hire a sharecropper's granddaughter as their program officer. And it's a pretty easy way to get better at that kind of funding.
However, the effort that it takes, and I need to say this, to turn around what's called or considered a legacy charity,
I shouldn't make it seem easy. You're right.
it is not easy at all. And it is the work of changing hearts and minds and doing that work first with the board and the leadership and then with the staff itself. So it's not easy.
So, about an hour into the podcast, we're going to talk about we're going to start talking about your current job. You are the CEO of the Women's Foundation of the South.
Yes.
My guess is you do something funding, you fund women in the South.
Yes, absolutely.
In fact, no, I have looked over the website a little bit and I have some questions here to ask. One thing I'd love for some clarity for the audience and for myself is I noticed that you spelled women a couple different ways on the website. Can you explain?
Yes. Well, the Women's Foundation of the South is a new public charity. We're a new public foundation. We opened our doors in 2021, and the planning that went into creating the Women's Foundation started in late 2019 and engaged a diverse group of women. So, in that group of women, we had Black women, white women, Latinas, Muslims, trans women organizers, queer women, and young women. And at that time, so the organization was named and the charter was established for WFS, and then the planning for actually mounting the foundation started. And in that process of engaging the kitchen cabinet of women and talking about how to make it inclusive, one of the recommendations that came early on was to have a different spelling of women and spell women with an X to be inclusive of non-binary people. Where we are now, just in terms of where culture is moving, where the field is moving, we've heard from our trans women allies that the spelling of women with a X is challenging for them because they feel as though it places them outside of a definition of woman. And they would prefer that we spell women the way that women is spelled and be very clear that that includes trans women as well as non-binary, and that we also support non-binary people. So this is a language. So the point that I'm making is that this is an area of growth, of inquiry for us, and evolution. And I think we're at a place now where we're going to start removing the X, go to the traditional spelling of women, and make it clear that we support trans women and non-binary people.
I think so. Language is a not a static thing. It's dynamic. It flows and changes. If you were to meet people speaking English 500 years ago, we would not understand what they were saying, and people 500 years from now will not understand this podcast. Um, and I think it's just that and I think generally I agree with that. I also think it could potentially, right? You want to include the people, particularly the people you are funding, and make it clear to them that they are included. But also, you do need to do fundraising and explain to the public what you're doing. And
Exactly.
the two spellings confused me. I'm a pretty inclusive guy who works in philanthropy, and it was hard for me to figure out, particularly that and I think you clarified it. They had already named it, and then you
Yeah.
decided to start using the language, and now, in fact, just going backwards.
But now we're going back.
We're
And
having a
I
similar
think it's
issue
just
here
going
with.
to take a moment.
It sounds very similar to me to the international philanthropy is going back and forth on global South, right? And whether so there needs to be some sort of terminology to refer to the countries that receive grants versus the countries that give grants. But that's a lot of words, right? So there was third world in the past, and that's long underused and marginalized. Global South is the one that's being used for the most. And what's very interesting to me is that the people who have said to me that they don't like it all live in the global north. And then the folks
Wow.
who I work with, like the actual proposal authors who live in the global south, are like, yes, that's fair. That's a fine way to describe it, even though sometimes it very much doesn't make sense. So, like, it doesn't include South Africa, and it does include Ukraine, which is one of the northernmost countries, but it's not so much a geographic thing.
It's bizarre.
But yeah, sometimes and it's just tough. I think it highlights, and we can move on from language. Language can just be bizarre. And especially when you're working with philanthropy often involves people from two different cultures trying to work together. That means they could be using different types of language. And it's just one of the many things that makes the work difficult. Anyway, so thank you for that explanation and for your work on behalf of Women of the South. What is it that you do for Women of the South at the Women's Foundation of the South?
Sure. The Women's Foundation of the South is committed to building health, wealth, and power for women and girls of color in the South. We recognize that of all philanthropic investment, women and girls of color in the South receive the absolute least. We receive $2.36 per woman and girl in the South. And when nonprofits are led by a Black woman, that amount is often cut in half. So, in terms of how we help women and girls of color in the South not just survive here, but thrive, is why we were founded and why we are committed to building a permanent inheritance for women and girls of color in the South. We're very clear that the issues that impact women and women of color in the South are the result of generational harm that's been done, whether you're talking through racism or patriarchy. So, in terms of the solutions and the investment that's needed to help heal this harm, we're clear that that has to be generational investment as well. So we've been building this entity from the ground up. We were founded by women of color grant makers and allies. And it's been interesting building this from the ground up. On one hand, we do not have a donor, whether that donor is dead or alive, that we're beholding to, that we are fulfilling someone else's vision of what it
No, Eugene
means to
and Agnes.
support
You don't have to
women
worry
and
about
girls of color. Exactly.
what Agnes might have thought of this.
Exactly. But the other challenge is, securing the resources and thinking differently, and thinking outside the box to build a philanthropic entity. And so that has been both fun, challenging,
Mhm.
and exciting.
So I'd like to get to the practical steps that you've taken towards building your organization in a moment. But just this is something that we've discussed with many other guests, and something that I actually get at. Some people consider me an expert in philanthropy. That's how few experts in philanthropy there are. But I get asked a lot, like, why is the percentage of funding that goes to women of color so low, particularly Black women in the U.S.? And like you can, there's so much like I don't need any more stats. Like I've seen the numbers on it. It's just so it's the percentage of funding that Black women receive in this country is basically the statistical margin of error. Like it's possible that that like you get like 2% of all the funding. It's possible that we just counted wrong and you actually get nothing. Right? Like it's so and in my whole career, early in my career, I've heard leaders in philanthropy talking about trying to raise this, trying to get the percentages up. So there's been deliberate effort for decades, and as I understand, it's not really going up. Is it?
Um, well, the Ms. Foundation, who unearthed that data that I quoted, they're about to release a new pocket change report. I suspect it's not going up, and I suspect in the South, where this trend is pretty profound, because you're talking about historical and also deliberate, either disinvestment or underinvestment in women and girls of color in the South. But yet, when you look at other indices like the U.S. Women's Peace and Security Index, it shows that every single Southern state falls below the national average in how well women of color are doing in the areas of health, in the areas of economic security, and also in terms of dealing with discrimination. So we have a far way to go to lift the South. And
What
to
was that?
me,
You it was $2 out of every. What was this
$2.36 per woman and girl.
per year? That's that's the amount of funding that goes to. They get $2.36 a year.
Yes,
So
per woman and
that is
girl.
basically nothing. You can't really do anything with $2.36.
Yeah. How can you
I
get
can't
to
buy a cup of
systemic
coffee.
change?
Yeah. Sorry, that's I've not heard that particular number. That is
That comes from the Ms. Foundation's
compared
pocket change
to
report.
what like a white men, young white men. Do you know the number per young white man?
I don't know, but there's another number that looks at all women and girls is like $16 and some
Okay.
change, just to give you an idea.
Yeah.
But then women, period, receive less funding than
But yeah,
other
anytime
issues.
I see stats on it, like I said, I don't need to see them. They're just always so alarming to me. It's just so paltry. It's not just that it's just a little that it's low and needs to go up. It is like we're not doing it. We're not funding women of color, right? And I what's confusing to me is again my whole career in philanthropy. I've been hearing people talk about how we have to increase this amount of funding. So even with intent,
Well,
it's not. It doesn't seem to be going up.
this goes back to an earlier point that we talked about when you were talking about caring about broad overarching issues like poverty, like single heads of households, like um, equal pay or what have you, or child care, early childhood. And you are not willing to name the people who are most impacted by these disparities or develop solutions and strategies to support those who are working most closely to these issues, who are often Black and Brown people, other people of color. Then how are you really, truly addressing those issues? And there's a trend in philanthropy to look at funding with I've heard many different terms, and you know, I must say that I've used some of them, like funding anchor organizations, funding mainstream organizations, or funding.
Sophisticated proposals.
And when you do
High
that,
quality proposals versus low quality proposals.
yeah, you're exactly,
Grant readiness. Grant readiness.
you're cutting out
Yep.
those organizations that often are led by people of color, or even employing specific strategies that address the needs of people of color when you do that. And like for instance, when we were first took our work to Mississippi, and we asked women in Mississippi what their experience was with philanthropy, the first word that was shared was traumatic.
Hmm.
And it took me aback. And we asked, can you tell us more about that? And they said, well, it's been traumatic to have to be validated by larger white organizations. And to have a funder say, well, who can validate you and validate your work? And often we have to have a white organization, a white leader validate our work. And then sometimes the money goes through them to support us, and sometimes we never see it. So those were the kinds of experiences that women were sharing with us. Um, and as a grant maker, being in this for some time and sometime here in the South, it is profound how these issues play out and how little these leaders who are on the ground, who are solution bearers in their own right, who are most proximate to the problem, are overlooked. Overlooked. And that's what we're here to change.
So the you mentioned that there's been a challenge to acquire the funding, right? Because there's no Eugene and Agnes did not leave a large amount of money to give away in perpetuity. You've had to start from scratch from since
Exactly.
2021. So how is the foundation funded? How do you do that?
Well, the interesting thing is our first $100,000 came from a campaign that we did reaching out to Black women who work in philanthropy from across the country. We asked them to give of their own treasure. We asked them to also ask their allies and their colleagues to give. And lastly, we asked them to have their institutions match their gifts. And that activity generated about $100,000 over 4 months. And then it helped us
That's a great campaign. Good
leverage,
work.
yeah, and then it helped us leverage larger institutional dollars. So by August 21, we were able to open our doors with 1.3 million. And since then, we have raised nearly $7 million in support to support operations, grant making, and out year funding. So some of that I don't necessarily, I'm not sitting here holding $7
Of course.
million. Some of that is for operations in 24 and 25. Um, but we have committed more than $1 million in grant making and programmatic support to nearly, by this year, it would be a total of 80 nonprofits in 4 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Texas.
That's an excellent fundraising campaign. It seems to me that the when the larger institutional donors first hear about it, there's already like one of their own program officers donating their own treasure, right? And a whole network of of people who work in philanthropy saying this is legitimate, and six figures already of resources that they have. This is put you in that's just sort of very clever. You knew what you were doing. No wonder they made you the CEO. That was your strategy? That the fundraising?
No, isn't
Okay.
that great? It
Yep.
wasn't. And I say, isn't that great? Because we have this kitchen cabinet of women
Yep.
who have all poured countless hours into being, as I
Yeah.
call, doulas to
I think
help bring this entity to life.
I would love
And
for someone to just present great fundraising strategies to me
mhm,
that I
absolutely.
could then execute from a cheap
And
office.
this worked like a charm. And one of the people who helped, who actually, whose idea it was, she works with me as well. Her name is Christy Wallace Slater. She came to us from the Kellogg Foundation. She's now our vice president of programs. And we've been able to secure top talent like Christy
Yeah,
working with
Kellogg,
us
the,
and
the
growing this
biggest
work.
funder of K through 12 education in the world. I think
Mhm.
that's cereal money.
Yes. So we have Kellogg support. Our first
Terrific.
transformative investment came from Pivotal Ventures, which is
Yep.
Melinda
Right.
French
Yeah.
Gates's work.
Awesome.
Uh, we're supported by Mary Reynolds Babcock, by the Kresge Foundation, several. So
I
we've
read their
been,
emails.
yes, so we've been
Penske
pretty
has a great
blessed.
newsletter, particularly about
Yes.
people who are interested in funding entrepreneurship. Um, so, how does the foundation decide where to give its grants or make its investments? As I understand, you also work with for-profit companies.
Um, well, we want to look at investing in businesses that are owned by women of color in the South. We have not started that process yet.
Mhm.
What we have done is we have commissioned a study that is being done by Tulane University School of Public um, Administration, the John Lewis School of Public Administration. And we're working with them to do a study of CDFIs across the South and looking at,
CDFI.
sorry, community development funding institutions, CDFI, finance institutions, CDFIs.
Yes.
So looking at CDFIs across the South and how they are, in fact, or not, getting dollars to the ground to women of color owned businesses. So this is a study that we're hoping the first part of it will come out next July, and we're looking at 6 states now. We'll continue to wrap with the other seven, and hopefully that will inform what our role is in this ecosystem of supporting women of color led businesses. So this part, we're that's still in R&D, so to speak. In terms of the work that we've done to support nonprofits that support women and girls of color. On that front, we have, it was a part of our strategic plan to do listening sessions across the South to learn from organizations that support women of color leaders about what their challenges are, where they see opportunities, so on and so forth. 30 days after we opened our doors in Louisiana, our state was hit by Hurricane Ida. And we immediately were like, okay, what is the best way for us to support nonprofits that serve women and girls of color in this moment in our home state? And we decided the most strategic thing for us to do was to put a gender lens on disaster recovery, disaster response, and what it meant to evacuate, what it meant to support people who are undocumented, what it meant for women who were, or people who were pregnant or birthing through a hurricane, and what it meant to support communities that are returning from incarceration but need to evacuate. Um, so we instead chose about 28 organizations that were either serving community or needed help being stood back up because they served deeply marginalized communities. And we lent our voice to the recovery effort and lifted up these nonprofits. And when we received our first set of dollars to help us for regranting, we acknowledge that these groups had been responding to COVID for 2 years at that point, and those leaders were just exhausted. And now Ida, on top of that, we had an eviction crisis happening in our state. There were just a multitude. Domestic violence was at an all-time high, and it's like, oh goodness, we can't just pull people away from what they're doing for a listening session to help us build the foundation. So instead, we decided to pour into those leaders, to give to them. We created a program called Woke at Rest, which is a play on words. And we sent love boxes across the state of Louisiana to these leaders who we knew were stretched and pressed incredibly thin.
So
And we
how did
invited
you
them.
know that?
Well, I had worked for the Greater New Orleans Foundation before coming into this role. So I was VP of programs there. So I worked very closely in understanding who the ecosystem of nonprofits were, especially in Southeast Louisiana. And then we worked with organizations that were more umbrella organizations that brought together networks of groups, especially in the birth justice area, or people who were working with birth support. And then we asked them as community partners to help inform us as to who those organizations were. So, so we had relationships with many of the nonprofits, not all, but we have relationships with many because we were grant
Certainly, there
makers.
are nonprofits in the South that serve women of color. They probably have leaders who are women of color that did not get a grant from you.
Oh, absolutely. We couldn't fund everybody. We had only a
You can't.
tiny amount
It's
of
just
money.
you, a lot of folks who don't work in philanthropy don't understand you can't fund everybody. It's not necessarily
Yeah,
a commonly known thing. You do. You have to make some hard choices as a funder, correct?
absolutely. Absolutely. And who we selected for funding were those leaders whose work we lifted up. And we focused on groups who were working with marginalized communities. We focused on those leaders who were working deep in the coast, doing statewide work. And we consider our three pillars: health, and then wealth or economic security, and then power. We look at being community organizing, leadership development, and power building work. So that gave us a mix of folks who were working in everything from the maternal mortality crisis to mental health support, on the economic security front, working on housing, working on establishing collaboratives, and then on the power building front, um, working on issues like voting rights and reproductive justice, so on and so forth. So that kind of gave us the formula, so to speak, for who we started out with. And then once we went to Mississippi, we knew some nonprofits in Mississippi, but we really needed to work with more. So we first appealed to a large group of funders in Mississippi, and we brought them together for dinner, and we asked them not only who were they funding, but we also asked them who couldn't they fund, either because they're not grant ready, they're too small, they lack capacity, whatever the reasons were. And then we also looked at the same model of looking at organizations that worked in collaboration, like broader networks of nonprofits. And that's how we developed our group of grantees for Mississippi. And the same is true for Texas, and the same is true for Atlanta, for Dallas and Texas, and then Atlanta in Georgia.
So they wouldn't, in order to be considered by the Women's Foundation of the South, you need to be somewhat of a useful actor in your community, already involved in some kind of work, to the point where the local funders or some kind of network or somebody you just mentioned already knows you and has that relationship.
Yes. At this stage in the game, um, consider us still in development.
Yeah,
These first,
you need to learn about these folks. Again, you wouldn't be able to fund, even if you could identify all of them, you wouldn't be able to fund all of them, right?
no,
You can't even, you're still in the stage of trying to identify all of them.
yes, and this is our effort to do ground truthing, to understand more about what's happening on the ground in various states, to get to know the women who we seek to support, and to know what their issues are, how what they see as the opportunities or the challenges in their respective states and in their respective community. We feel it's very important for us to enter place very respectfully and to learn and be in partnership with the women who we seek to serve. So this is our moment of growing this work. It's our goal. We have a pretty big footprint, being 13 states. Is and we're in four now. We plan to grow to two more next year. And it's our hope that we will grow across our entire footprint within 5 years. So within 5 years, we will have connected more than 300 leaders within this space of working with women and girls of color, connected them within their states and across the South.
So in the process, do you read grant proposals from the groups that you fund?
I personally,
Or are there grant? Do they exist?
we do.
You don't, you're not the
We
program
have a
officer
very
anymore, so you don't have to.
small,
You don't have to. Do you actually? I hadn't considered that, but do you personally read them?
I do, because I get the final approval,
Are you reading
and
80 or 80 to 90 around like you were at Meyer?
no, it's not. It's not nearly on that scale. It's not nearly on that scale. The program that we do called Woke at Rest, we make very small grants available to leaders, to nonprofit organizations to support the leadership development of their leadership development and their restoration, and they get to determine how those funds are used. So they understand that if it's for strictly personal reasons, like to help support a vacation or something like that, then those dollars are taxable to the leader. That's not us, that's the IRS.
That's how it works.
And if there are other ways that they can support the leadership. So we make those grants available, and part of that is we have, as a part of our application process, a self-care assessment. And on that assessment, there's a possible of 30 points for how well you're hydrating, how well you're eating, are you resting, are you connecting with families and friends, um, are you taking vacation? And our leaders in our first cohort scored an average score of 9. Um, and I don't think we've gotten, I think we've raised in that. I'd be interested. I don't know the data for our second and third and
Mhm.
now fourth cohort that's applying. But we look and we evaluate how they come. We check in with them via not making them do a large onerous report, but we do an interview, phone interview, and that serves as their interim. We also check in at the end, and that serves as their reporting to us. So we try to bring all the promising practices of the field to bear, and center that as a way of working with women, women of color led and women of color serving organizations.
So I worked in DC for a long time, and I am the founder of the Unfunded List. And through those both those experiences, I've had the opportunity to work with many excellent women of color fundraisers, hundreds probably. I have 1,500 volunteers on my committee, and it is mostly women of color, over half of them women of color.
Wow.
And same with, again, I started in DC, and that's where I was recruiting from. And I was working at, right, that's who I was just recruiting the people in my office, and that's who was in my office. But it's been a tremendous response. And also, a lot of the people who send us proposals for review are either supporting the community or members of it. And I would say a major challenge I'm hearing consistently, including from the young, particularly young fundraising women of color who are like on my board or on my committees and stuff. They find it very difficult to be effective board members because they're so burnt out at work. And that is just a huge problem, right? Because if not, it's not only is the work probably suffering and her personal life suffering, which are the two by far the two most important suffering.
Well,
But
I
also,
tell
she's not
you,
able to serve unfunded list in the way that she would like because of those. And so in her civic, you mentioned power, right? It's not just their personal health and wealth. that's being hit here. Their ability to give, they would love to be able to give feedback to these proposals, but they have to put their personal health and wealth first, and so they don't always have the time to be powerful in that way. It is a very powerful thing to do here. Review the grant proposals that we read. You can be a real influencer, not a social media influencer, but an actual influencer when you do this kind of volunteer work. And I imagine I'm not the only person who's aware of this, right? I'm sure perhaps places like the AME Church are seeing less volunteering as a result of this kind of stuff. And these are women who've chosen to work in the nonprofit sector, and they're getting just burnt out. They're saying, all right, you're going to be the director of development and communications. Right? And then we're going to sneak in a couple extra jobs underneath that too. As someone more familiar with the challenges of women of color fundraisers, what are the like what are the major challenges for all fundraisers, particularly
Well,
women of color?
let, let me just say this. Before we move to fundraisers, just talking about these organizations that we know statistically are deeply under resourced.
Yeah,
Our work is kind of lifting the skirt, so to speak, to understand what it means to be so deeply resourced.
yeah.
So I've met leaders who have liquidated their retirements to fund their nonprofit. We've had leaders who
You're talking to
were,
one right now, but
pardon me?
I did. I also this is a comment. I did that. I do not have a retirement fund anymore, so that we can do this sort of thing. It's hard to get stuff funded. Lots of folks have done
Oh.
tremendous amounts of personal sacrifice that the public is
Um,
aware of, for sure.
and also nonprofits who we've had leaders who are staff of one nonprofit and the executive director of another. So leaders who have to work multiple jobs,
Yeah,
leaders who are working at great cost to themselves. So in terms of dealing with toxic stress and just the pressure of being up against what these women are fighting in their communities. For instance, we visited four nonprofits that do reproductive justice work in Mississippi. And boy, was I floored to understand that the number one issue that they all spoke of was food insecurity. Just would not compute. But the work that our groups are doing are so deeply intersectional because the lives of women, and especially women of color, are so deeply intersectional that they're worried about feeding children and seniors and people, and saying there are people in their community who are making choices between paying their mortgage and eating. So um and we've had leaders that have had high instances of cancer, high instances of high blood pressure, diabetes. So the toll for doing this work and the cost of doing this work as a woman of color is incredibly high. And I would say that's especially true in the nonprofit sector where they are often so deeply under resourced, but just often professionally in other fields. It's sad we lost two Black women who were university presidents this year who, passed away unexpectedly, whether it was heart attacks or what have you. And some people have said to me, I just can't imagine what stress they were under in their job. And I said, well, I think the bigger question is the stress they endured getting to that job as well as on that job. And so working from a place where the labor is not valued to at the same amount as our um, male and um, other female counterparts, it's tough.
yeah. I think a lot of it is just is the sector. There's many folks. I call it the JV business problem. Right, nonprofits are like the JV business team. They could use the field, right, as long as the varsity team doesn't need it. Right.
Yeah.
Um, have you as someone who's worked entirely in philanthropy, right? Can you talk about a little like what is it that is different about the world of nonprofits and philanthropy funding versus right those who have a bottom line, people who are primarily concerned with profit? Like, what do you see? And so, and this is something you'll have to do as I understand, you're currently thinking about at the foundation. You'll have a different process for funding businesses, I assume.
Yes, yes.
So what? So how will you be thinking about these two different groups? And for numbers' sakes, nonprofits are about 1/5 of the entire economy, all the money and transactions and everything. So 80% of the world is for-profit business, and 20% of it is the philanthropic sector here with its burnt out leaders, right? And people dying early of heart attacks and all of that.
Well, I
Um,
think, going back to my background, you have to look at history and where we are right now and the impact of the pandemic. So none of this is within a vacuum. So the pandemic in the pandemic, you had women of color who lost jobs at the highest rate, were most impacted. In cities like New Orleans, where I live, you have so many women of color who worked in hospitality and in food service. This is a tourist area. We were hard hit. And the group that was hit the hardest were women of color. And in this moment where people are pulling up and lifting up from this time, we had more people start businesses, and a lot of them were women of color. So we already had a significant number of women of color owned businesses in the South. That number has increased through the pandemic, and I would say that in terms of how they are resourced, very similarly, you have women of color own businesses that receive the smallest share of investment capital
it's
than any other group.
2% of VC funding.
Yet they employ from the community
Mm.
and have great potential. I was a part of this discussion that looked at their tenacity, and they early on might present with a high level of tenacity because some of the things that they're doing to be funded are similar to nonprofits. There are a lot of folks who have done things like liquidate their retirements, like take out different, if they have a home, take out home equity loans, and so on and so
You
forth.
mentioned
So
the two jobs thing, something I see a lot. I'm talking to folks who they have a day job and they're also writing proposals for their nonprofit.
yes,
And I'm in
and
the
they have a hustle.
unenviable. I have to explain to them. I'm like, that's going to make it very hard for you to be competitive because you're doing it after school and they're doing it in the morning with their coffee. Like,
Exactly. So I would say, in terms of differences between the two, when it comes to women of color owned businesses as well as nonprofits that are either led by women of color or serving women of color, they share this common experience of being deeply under resourced and trying to make ends meet however they can. And what it does is it diminishes often their own personal wealth and well being to do the work, as well as put them in a position of incredible stress and strain.
yes. You talked about this a little bit earlier with the women in Mississippi. I think it was that their first response to the word philanthropy was traumatic. But what do women of color in the South think about philanthropy, the world of philanthropy in general? They've
Say
had,
that one more time. I'm sorry.
if you were to do a poll of women of color in the South and ask them, what is your opinion of philanthropy? What do you think about it? What do you think they would say? What kind of responses do you think you would get?
Well, I think one, many people do not understand or consider their giving or how they receive support as philanthropy.
Mm.
So I think there's a difference between big P philanthropy, professional philanthropy, and small p philanthropy. I think philanthropy exists in community of color and has existed for a very
Long
long
time, very
time
long time.
in many informal ways, but it's not called philanthropy. It might be the way that we support people who are, pulling together resources to help someone go to college or pull resources together to bail somebody out. I mean, there's many different ways that philanthropy works in community that people don't necessarily understand that to be philanthropy. And in terms of how people who I've encountered seeing philanthropy in the South, big P philanthropy South, as white. It is often these are unmarked white institutions with white priorities, and it's not for us.
Mhm.
It's not for us. And that is how, unfortunately, a lot of people view philanthropy. They're very clear about the choices that are made and not made to support community. And when certain folks get through, pretty excited, but it's also very clear how difficult it is to get through. So therefore, I think there is a lot of I think there is a lot of distrust of traditional philanthropy in the South.
Yeah, I would generally agree. I remember seeing often in DC, which is arguably the South. To me, it was very much the South coming from Maine. But I've seen local polling there, and the response to the word philanthropy is very negative. Usually, they've just got some, and it's very similar to what you've just said. I think white philanthropists for a very long time were very good at talking about their legacy and putting their names on things, and that's ultimately had the effect that we're talking about, which is probably not what they intended. Um, when it comes to philanthropy, what are you the most excited about? We've spent a decent amount of time here talking about some of the problems with it. We both work in philanthropy, so we must see its value as well. What are you excited about? Especially when it comes to the future. What's getting you up and excited every day?
I am so excited about the promise of collective power of I mean, this organization exists because of will. There was incredible will among a diverse group of women to say that WFS must exist. And it's been that will that has marshaled individual giving, um, national philanthropy giving, regional philanthropy, or regional philanthropic giving, as well as corporate giving. And we are at an exciting place where we are positioned to accept gifts of illiquid assets. We had we received our first planned gift last year, so we started a legacy society, and we're working with donors on planned gifts, which is exciting. And basically, it's like, how do we, and I think it's coming from working from a private foundation to a community foundation to now this being a public foundation that's being built from the ground up. How do we marshal all the tools that we do in philanthropy? How do we marshal all of these tools to grow this organization in a way that multiple people have a stake and feel that this work belongs to them? So that's what makes me excited. And we're bringing all this to bear in our endowment campaign, which we will be launching in 2024. And I'm so excited about this endowment campaign. We are calling it we're calling it the Sacred Mothers of the South Legacy Campaign. And we're going to give Americans from across the country the opportunity to honor a sacred mother from the South whose shoulders they stand on or who has inspired them to dream. Um, and for this, we are partnering with Microsoft Philanthropies to build what this digital presence will be for how we honor the stories of these unsung women, whether they are living legacies or ancestors. And we're in the process of brokering a partnership with Ancestry to
Hmm.
see how we can not only help people celebrate their sacred mothers, but also find them as well. So I'm very excited for what this will look like. And, we're doing things that are just out the box. Typically, nonprofits that have been around under 5 years don't launch endowment campaigns, but we feel an endowment campaign is very critical for our work.
They're
We
usually not
want
you're in
this,
a position to, I would say, just to put my
yeah, we want this to be
feasibility hat
sustainable.
on for a moment. Normally, I would tell someone under 5 years, don't do it, but you've had some un, like unusual success. I hesitate to call it unusual because, of course, you're just it seems like you put the right team together, came up with the right strategy, and so there's nothing unusual about something like that being successful. But most nonprofits aren't putting capital together like that very early on, particularly as we've noted a couple of times, women of color led nonprofits much less likely to be able to do a capital campaign. And I agree that is all very exciting. I wish you the best of luck with it. I wish I could
Thank
tell you that
you.
there was a very large number of very wealthy donors that listen to the podcast, and if any of them are listening, I'm sure that they'll be interested to hear more, and they'll look forward to that campaign launching in 2024. It is probably mostly another group that we've talked about today, the burnt out folks running nonprofits, listening to the show at work. Soon you'll have to pick something else to listen to, or maybe it'll just automatically go into the next episode. Is there anything else that you would like to leave our audience with, Carmen?
Well, I encourage people to follow us on social, visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, get engaged, and stay connected to us. If you're interested in knowing more about the Mothers of the South Legacy campaign, get our newsletter, and we will be unveiling more about that campaign in our newsletter in months to come. But also, I just encourage people to follow us and join us.
Um, Excellent. When my mother lives in the South, so I like she's not Southern, but she retired down there now, so I like the campaign. And she is, of course, married to my father, who was a guest on the show once. And when he was on, he spent a long time talking about a guy named de Tocqueville, Henri de Tocqueville,
Oh,
who was
yeah.
a French philosopher who did a tour of the U.S. early in our history. And he said the thing that we had the potential to be the greatest nation of all time, and that the main reason he also had a lot to say about all the stolen land and stolen labor. But he also said that we had the potential to be the greatest nation of all time, largely because of our ability for regular citizens to form voluntary associations, like you and the rest of the women of the South have with the foundation. Unlike any country before this, regular folks would come together without the permission of their feudal lord or anybody else, right? And form an organization, gather their capital, choose a mission, right, and go after it. And so you are, I think de Tocqueville would be very impressed. I think a lot of people will be very impressed. And it seems like you've already impressed a lot of folks. Hopefully, those of you listening have been impressed as well. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Carmen, for joining us. Thank you, David
Thank
Jaffe,
you.
for editing this episode. I think we did one clean cut. I don't think we're going to have any. There were no ambulance sounds or anything that we're going to need to remove. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Carmen. I'm sure
Thank you.
you probably have all kinds of work to get done. David will find a pretty good spot to cut probably before
Thank
this.
you.
Hopefully we have some closeout music as well. usually we find a good spot to go to. Thank you very much. It was a good long interview.
Yes, this was awesome. Thank you for
I
having me,
enjoy, I
Dave.
enjoy talking with you. It's neat to, a lot of the folks up here in Maine, like when they ask me what I do, I'm like, oh, I'm a fundraiser, and that's pretty much as far into it as I get. I always enjoy the opportunity to like actually get into have a good long conversation about like the practice and the work and everything.
Well, this is
Uh,
great.
and like I said, it's a thing that comes up for me all the time, not just on the podcast, but with my authors and others. You're right. It seems simple to me, right? In making large general operating funding in women of color led organizations will make things better, not just for those organizations that they serve, but in
But for the
myriad
people
ways.
they serve.
Honestly, it's just sort of it seems very clear that that's what to do, and it's not happening. And it is. And honestly, I should know. I should know why. I should have a better understanding of why it's not happening. Like I said, there are people who call me an expert in this stuff, and I don't. And yeah, I'm slowly getting into the bottom of it. And there's a lot of folks like you out there actually trying to do something about it. So thank you very much. And I'll let you get on with the rest of your day. We have pretty quick turnaround on the episodes.
Okay.
So, and I don't think there's going to be much editing. So I think we'll have this one out soon.
Oh, please let us know when it's out. We'd like to share it with our networks.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I am headed now to Alabama.
Alabama.
Alabama
Pennsylvania of
for
the South.
Philanthropy. I'm going for Philanthropy Southeast, and we have
Cool.
won our first award.
You won an
we
award.
are a Truest
Award-winning
Award
guest.
winner. Yes, yes, for our Woke at Rest program. So, and
What award did you win?
we won the Truest Award.
Truest.
Yeah, Truist, Truist,
Named
the
after
Truist Award.
There's a company, Truist.
Yes.
They're in philanthropy.
And this award was specifically for deploying many different tools of philanthropy through our programmatic work. So not only are we giving the leadership grants, but we also are investing in strategic communications and lifting the voices of the women who we serve.
So you're getting an award for your interdisciplinary work, and you had
yes.
It all goes back to your interdisciplinary education.
Yes. This has been great. Thank you so much, Dave and David. I appreciate it, and I better get busy. My team is coming for me in 45 minutes. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Need anything from me?
Bye-bye.
Good.